He died in the last year. Was a wonderful leader and scholar here at Hartford Seminary, and a good friend to many of us. We remember him with special joy tonight. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Yahya Michaud, who's going to introduce our Bijlefeld speaker for tonight.
Good evening, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Peace to you all. Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl was born in Kuwait in 1963 and got his PhD in Islamic Studies in Princeton in 1999. He is currently the Omar and Esmeralda Alfi Distinguished Professor in Islamic Law at the UCLA School of Law, where he teaches courses on international human rights, Islamic jurisprudence, national security law, law and terrorism, Islam and human rights, political asylum and political crimes and legal systems. He is also the chair of the Islamic Studies Interdepartmental Program at UCLA. To enumerate the many honors and distinctions Professor Abou El Fadl has been awarded in the US and abroad would take too long, and you have all come to the seminary this evening to hear him, not me. Were I to mention here the titles of his numerous books, the problem would be similar. So there are just a few of them here. The Place of Tolerance in Islam, The Great Theft, Wresting Islam from the Extremists, and God Knows the Soldiers. The last one, which you will be able to purchase, Their Reasoning with God, and which I can see on the table where you will speak. Rebellion and Violence in Islamic Law, The Search for Beauty in Islam, a conference of the books, and Speaking in God's Name, Islamic Law, Authority and Woman, and there are many others. And so, today's societies and religions too often are drifting towards violence and terror, or hyper-emotionalism and shallow mysticism. Between such spiritual cancer and spiritual diabetes, the unadulterated, healthy minds ready to speak the truth and able to offer real hope are rare. As a scholar, lawyer, public intellectual, Professor Abou El Fadl is one of these true Muslim humanists in the Renaissance sense, be it the Baghdadi Renaissance of the 10th century, the Andalusian one, or the Italian one. Professor Abou El Fadl is, of course, immensely erudite, enlightened, actively involved in the societal challenges of our time. Even more important, he is deeply aware, says openly, and repeats in his lectures as well as in his books, that God's beauty, Jamal, is as essential as his majesty, Jalal. The William A. Bijlefeld Lecture is named after the first director of the MacDonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations at Hartford Seminary. It is intended to bring a distinguished scholar to our campus for a public presentation on Islam or Christian-Muslim relations to promote interreligious understanding and mutual respect in the local, national, and world communities. We would not have dreamed of a more eminent scholar than Professor Abou El Fadl to deliver this year's Bijlefeld Lecture, and we are extremely delighted and thankful that he so generously accepted our invitation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Abou El Fadl to our seminar.
Thank you immensely أخرجكم تواضعنا في استئنافك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. steady stream of very distinguished scholars. And it's rather unique in being a seminary that at the same time has provided the atmosphere and the support for serious scholarship on Islam and allowed for the sprouting of several quite eminent names. Among those students, of course, are people who Professor Ayub, who I consider a friend, an old friend from the Temple days and when I was in Philadelphia. And I have been fascinated by the works of Professor Michaud as well as so many others that if I would name, then it would take the rest of the night. It is, as you are all aware, a difficult time to speak about Shari'ah. It is not just difficult in the West, but Shari'ah has, even as a concept, as a symbolic concept, has become highly problematized and a term that raises profound passions in the Muslim world. Many of these passions are not supportive and not positive. Some of you might be well aware of the emergence of movements such as the Quranists or similar that believe that there is that Shari'ah is not essential to Islam and that Shari'ah can be sort of split off, dissected in a surgical fashion so that we would dispose of Shari'ah and keep Islam. Along the same line, they have been enormous. We witnessed this, for instance, in the debates that I've been involved in post-revolutionary Egypt, where there's a narrative that equates Sharia with reactionism, Dalamiyya, as they call it, the darkness, or something that is profoundly a corruption of Islam. No, sorry. Now, this might be one can evaluate this simply on political grounds if it didn't raise such an immense theological problem. And if it didn't profoundly raise the question of the whole normative thrust of the Islamic faith. Whether, regardless of the instrumentalities, the processes that might be associated with Sharia, and regardless of the determinations that might be produced under the label of Sharia, there is a significant epistemological and moral as well as theological issue in the attempt to simply wave away Sharia as a solution to coming to terms or reconciling Islam to modernity. Of course, modernity, post-modernity, or some other form of terminology, depending on your epistemological beliefs. First, in order to explore this in a meaningful way, we need to develop or we need to accept certain terminology that will become key in unpacking the subject of Sharia and its theological role before we even get to its instrumental legalism or instrumental functionalism, its functional role. The terminology that I'm referring to are key words such as the word khilafah, deputyship, viceroyship, a form of delegation, amana, trust, an entrustment of sorts, and rahmah, mercy, as a critical component. And I will hope to walk with you through why we need to become comfortable with these three particular concepts. Khilafah or istikhlaf, amana, and rahmah. Did the Sharia emerge because there are particular ahkam or legal rulings found in the Quran? Did the Sharia emerge because there are ahkam or particular legal rulings found in the Sunnah? The answer, quite clearly, would be no. There were schools in early Islamic thought that gave great normative weight to the ahkam that are found, the legal determinations are found in the Quran, and what they considered acceptable of the Sunnah, but refused any expansion beyond these specific rulings in the specific situations that they apply to. In other words, they refused or rejected any notion of extension of the law by analogy or by qiyas, or any form of instrumentalization of a coherent system of legal thinking. And they ultimately ran into a fundamental, philosophical issue, which we find early Muslim jurists wrestling with. Jurists like Shafi'i in his and in Mudawan and Sahnun, as well even in Musannaf Abdul Razak and Musannaf Ibn Abi Shaybah in various reports. And that is why the divine intervention in particular events, either in the Quran or the Sunnah. We can, aside from the debate, the hermeneutical debate of what it meant, aside from the instrumental debate of how it should be applied, there is a fundamental foundational debate, and that is why should God intervene? Now, a premise of the Islamic faith and of Islamic discourses from the Quran onwards is the idea of a merciful God. A God, and let's be clear about what this mercifulness entails. This is a God that created creation and continued to care about what happens with this creation. There were some sects reported in, for instance, Khaled Abou El Fadl, some sects that are reported in even earlier texts on Firaq and so on, that argue that God created creation but had ended God's involvement with creation especially after the death of the Prophet. God no longer became interested in what happens not just to Muslims but to humanity. And we see that these sects didn't survive and didn't seem to have been very successful because they posed numerous theological problems. We find also in Khaled Abou El Fadl's monumental work on the notion of obligation, his book Al-Mughni. Of course, he has the second Khamsa, but a much more profound work is Al-Mughni. It was all and it's an early work in which Khaled Abou El Fadl said, well, does it make sense that we worship a God that would not continue to be involved with what God has created? Wouldn't a merciful God not just create, but continue providing guidance? One argument that Khaled Abou El Fadl poses to an interlocutor, whether some people have said that this interlocutor was an actual historical figure, let's put that aside for now. That, well, God has deposited all of God's mercy in the text of the Quran itself, and so there is no need for a continuing manifestation of rahmah and mercy through an ongoing pointers or adilla towards a path of goodness, because all that rahmah, all that mercy that God possesses was deposited in this one book of Revelation, and that's it. God did God's duty and God was done. Now this reminds one of some of the old rabbinic debates and old Talmudic debates that take place in the Jewish context. And one of the interesting points is that Khaled Abou El Fadl talks about certain strains of thought coming from both Greek philosophy and Jewish philosophy, and engages them in a variety of ways. And we find the tradition of kalam in Islamic history is very interested and is very concerned with the idea of a merciful but just God. Would a merciful and just God continue to legislate or continue to provide indicators to the path to goodness, would continue to intervene miraculously in human affairs, or even would continue the act of prophecy in some form or another, whether through the family of the prophet or through people who attain certain levels of godliness, and therefore the prophecy would continue. It is critical to understand that the genesis of these debates about the path are anchored in this fundamental philosophical question, theological question of what would a merciful God do, and what are the obligations and the implications of a merciful God. Okay. Now, of course, if you are interested in much more detail about these things that are flagging, the book was actually originally 800 pages, and the publisher squeezed by reducing the font and making the margins disappear, so it can look like a smaller book, because I insisted on not deleting anything, and I got my way, but yeah. So, all right. Now, the rahmah, this mercifulness, is in itself, and here I'm skipping several steps, but basically to move along, is that this rahmah itself, this mercifulness, in itself becomes the source of obligation. In other words, it becomes masdar al-taklif, as they would put it, that the fact that there is a merciful God would be engaged, interested, involved, and would be constantly so involved as to be in a constant state of knowledge about that which God created. And this issue of obligation is quite critical, because later on in natural law debates and in Thomas Aquinas' writings, he, building upon what Muslim philosophers wrote, there's this whole notion of, even if we say that we know what is good and we know what is bad, well, what is the source of an obligation to do good? Knowledge of something does not necessarily create an obligation to do something. And as Thomas Aquinas resolves it by sometimes siding with Ghazali's arguments, other times on other points siding with Averroes, even Rushd. But for the early debates that preceded Ghazali and preceded Averroes and Ibn Rushd, that the rahmah itself, that mercy by itself, which entails ihsan, a state of beneficence, in itself can become the source of obligation. Okay. Now, a technical but deceptive. If you sort of blink, as I tell my students, you can miss the significance. But are the actual laws a manifestation of this mercy? The mercy is the result, is the root or the source of the obligation to do certain things, and we'll talk about what things. But are the actual rules and regulations are the manifestation of God's mercy. And here, Muslim theologians and jurists said, well, ليس على الإطلاق, not in an unconditional, unrestricted way. Why is that? Because many of the laws that would be attributed to Shari'ah are based on a probability of belief, zon, and not certainty of belief, not yaqeen. And as such, we really cannot say yaqeen that all the laws that fall under the preview of Shari'ah are from God. And therefore, we cannot argue that, in fact, all the laws are a manifestation of God's mercy. And furthermore, we know that God intervenes under certain contingencies. So, for instance, when God intervenes in the case of the woman complaining about her husband who swore that she is like the back of her mother and the back of his mother, and she complains to God, and then God responds and gives her a ruling. Well, the whole engagement is a manifestation of God's mercy, but there are contingencies here that cannot be reproduced or generalized beyond that specific incident. So where does this leave us? Muslim jurists, in what I think, again, cutting through a long developmental process, said, well, let's go to as happens later on in several traditions, let's go to the narrative of creation itself. And the narrative of creation can shed light on what exactly is the role of this path that is implied by God's mercy. Shari'ah, in its essence, is just a word meaning the path from and to, or the source of the water source, the fountain of something. But it is used in a variety of contexts. So in the narrative of the Quran and the Sunnah, we say Shari'at al-Yahud, the Shari'ah of Jews. We say Shari'at al-Masih, the Shari'ah of Christians. We say Shari'at Qawm Nuh, the Shari'ah of people of Nuh, and so on and so forth. So in itself, Shari'ah just means a pass from and to. And in itself, it needs other sources than the simple word itself to allow us to know a pass to what and from what. Okay, now, here, the idea of khilafah and amana become quite critical. Let's go back to the Quranic narrative that plays a huge role in the development of what becomes known as Islamic law. So God, in the Quranic narrative says, I'm quoting from the Quran here, when your God told the angels, I am placing a successor, a Khalifa, on earth, they said, you will give the earth to beings who will cause corruption and bloodshed when we celebrate your praise and proclaim your holiness. God said, I know what you do not. I know what you do not know. Now, stop here. The angels are fully aware that those creatures that God are creating are not necessarily bound by only a capability to perform goodness, but are also troublemaking, naughty creatures. They are capable of being rancorous and disobedient. And God says, I know what you do not. But the story doesn't stop here. Then what follows is actually one of the most intriguing narratives. God, in order to demonstrate to the angels that God knows what they do not know, and that God is justified in creating these creatures, or at least to allow them to come to terms with God's creation of these creatures, God demonstrates what the angels do not know by the passage goes as follows. He then taught Adam all the names as well. Then he showed them the things named to the angels and said, tell me the names of these things if you are correct about your doubts. They, the angels, said, may you be glorified. We have knowledge only of what you have taught us. You are the all-knowing and wise. Then God said, Adam, tell them the names of things. And when Adam told them the names of things, God said, did I not tell you that I know the secrets, ghaib, of the heavens and earth, and I know what you reveal and what you try to conceal? Now, this parable begs a question, and that is, what are those names? And what is the big deal about the names? In fact, if you notice, the angels, when they're asked by God to name the names, they say, well, we don't know anything except what you've taught us. But we also know from the text that God taught Adam the names. One can argue that Adam could also say, we also know what you've taught us. So why the difference? Why, in fact, they seem to be exactly the same. If taught by God, they will know. So how does this prove anything? Well, so then that pushes the issue of names. So what are the names of things, the asma that Adam learned, and the learning of which was sufficiently compelling to persuade the angels that God knows what they do not know, and that the creation of beings who are capable of rancor and naughtiness, and Quranic language, shedding blood and causing corruption, is even worthwhile. Not only does this parable of learning and knowledge quiet down the angels, but the parable is followed by another describing a magnanimous moment elevating and dignifying humanity, and at the same time forever earning the ire and hostility of the symbol of evil, Iblis. God commands the angels and jinn to prostrate before the new beings created to become God's viceroys and to inherit the earth. While God celebrates the event as the moment when human beings, children of Adam, were honored and dignified, Iblis, Satan, protests on supremacist grounds. According to the Quran, Iblis refuses to prostrate because before this human creature, because after all, those inheritors of the earth, those human creatures, were created from something substandard, mud. And Iblis himself is created from ethereal fire. So, why are those creatures on such, what is the secret that qualifies those creatures to inherit the earth and do exactly what with it? Well, in the Quranic narrative, human beings are destined to inherit the earth as God's viceroys, as caliphs, before Adam and Eve indulged in the infamous tree worship. All of humanity is made God's caliphs, Khulafa' on earth, and human beings are equipped with the ability that promises something so compelling and impressive and meaningful that if one is able to overcome their own pride and their own prejudice, if one is able to, in other words, overcome what Iblis could not overcome, just like the prostrating angels, one would be content with sharing and honoring and celebrating this most special creature, capable of learning the names of things. Okay, now what are the names? Now, we know that there are, from Jewish mysticism, and we know from the tradition of Christian gnosis, and from various agnostic traditions and esoteric traditions, that a great deal of weight was placed in medieval epistemology on the power of names. We know that, in fact, that to know the name of the thing, and it's even among the hip musicians of today, the witches of today, the witchcraft of today. If the belief is, if you know the name of the thing, you control it, you have power over it, you even determine its destiny. But Muslim jurists were troubled by the Gnostic overtones of this idea that the names were simply the essence of everything that allows a person to have ultimate control and power. So, being told by this esoteric and Gnostic tradition, they insisted that the power given through the learning of names was the power of the creative mind, or what they call al-aql al-khamraq, largely influenced by Greek tradition. However, but it would be erroneous to say that that's where it all stops, that they were simply honored by the virtue of having reason for reason's own sake. Muslim jurists in these early debates, and you find this in Shafi'i's Risala, and again in Qadi al-Bishabar's 12-volume debates, that the idolatries of reason are more than capable of committing their own share of miseries. Reason and rational faculties are honored for the moral good they contribute, for the ability to become God's caliphs and pursue godliness. So, in a word, what the act of teaching the names eventually is interpreted into is the ability of human beings to accept what elsewhere the Quran calls the trust, the amana, and the trust is the will to achieve godliness or drift into ungodliness. Human beings are honored and celebrated because they're godlike, capable of doing godlike things. Many narratives in the Islamic tradition emphasize that God created humans in beauty, and that this is sufficient to obligate in and of themselves human beings to act beautifully, to make their external beauty as bearers of God's image reflective of their inner beauty. In another Quranic parable, God is said to have offered trust and amana to all of creation, but ultimately it was shouldered only by human beings. The Quran then somberly notes that bearing this trust is such an onerous and arduous task. I believe that this weighted trust for which human beings were honored and dignified is the marvel of divinity itself. Human beings are about nuances of the divine, inexhaustible anecdotes of divinity capable of creating such immeasurable acts of true beauty. As human beings invent and create beauty, they move toward the majestic caliphate of godliness. When human beings no longer seek or create beauty, forget their bonds to the ethereal and sublime, and slump into indolence and despair, human beings drift further away from godliness into its antithesis. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. God is the light of the heavens and the earth, light upon light. In every act of beauty, in every nuance that commemorates the truth of our divine nature and memorializes the caliphate of humanity, this istikhlaf, in the world, we move closer to the divine light, but in remaining static, in existing without beautification or in false beautification, or in subsisting without service born out of love, mercy, and compassion, that is, without the attributes and nuances of divinity, we no longer move toward the light, and in fact drift from the possibility of godliness to the darkness of godlessness. Now, you might be wondering at this point, what does this have to do with Sharia? I will tell you everything. Everything. Sharia was born out of a very basic idea. The idea was not the simple precedence of legislative acts taken by God in particular incidents involving criminal acts or involving inheritance. That in itself was not enough to create the whole epistemology of Sharia. The whole edifice that becomes usul al-fiqh, and that becomes the qawaid al-fiqhiyya, and that becomes the tradition of kalam, and that becomes the massive tradition of the munaza'at, and the massive tradition of tarjih, and muwazanat and tarjih, and so on. That in itself, precedents of rules, could not have created that impulse. The impulse, however, the notion of Sharia, the idea of Sharia itself, was planted, seeded in the very idea of carrying the amana, carrying the trust. And carrying the trust implied an act of deputyship and successorship, istikhlaf, from a God who is fundamentally and essentially and quintessentially merciful. And the challenge, which later on, Oriental scholars like this, they say, well, maqasid al-Sharia may be invented by Shatibi or a Qarafi. Later on, that's wrong. What all that Shatibi and Qarafi did was look at the earlier debates and said, hey, you lawyers who have lost themselves in what lawyers do, create distinctions, make arguments for the sake of arguments, appear brilliant in court with their oratory ability, but perform technical duties but lose sight of what it's all about. It's like when you go to law school, you easily lose sight that initially you thought of law school because at one point, at one time, you believed in the principles of the Constitution, in the idea of justice, in the idea of fairness, and eventually law school corrupts you enough into becoming a person about splitting hairs. And splitting hairs so you can justify big fees for yourself, and so you can justify whatever your client wants you to do. But essentially, every now and then comes a great jurist that says, like the Shatibi, like the Qarafi, and says, hold on. This is not what it was initially about. What it was about was a dream of beauty. In the Islamic case, it's a dream of beautification through godliness and a refusal to drift into godlessness. And that is why, if you don't, and again, if you don't believe me, read the book. That is why you have the possibility that people like Musawwibah emerge. People who reach, and this was among them is Imam al-Haramayn al-Juwayni and other notables of that magnitude, who said, you know, the real point of engaging in the search of Sharia is that you engage in the search. Not the answer you reach, but to engage in the search so that the act of ta'abbud is that you are thinking very hard about what a merciful God would want. Now, because we live in the world we live in today, inevitably people listen to this and say, but wait a minute, who practicing Sharia today thinks about a merciful God and a trust given by a merciful God and about the notion of imbuing oneself with the beauty of that merciful God and doing everything in order to recreate these moments, these flashes of luminous divinity. Who does that? ISIS, Qaeda, Taliban, you name it. I'm going to end with a story that actually took place with one of my teachers. His name, Allah yarhamah, was Sheikh Shawdi. I was always a dreamy boy, asking naive questions in silly ways. This is me talking about myself. The dreamy boy asking naive questions in silly ways. And of the mysteries that would bother me to no end is how people could inflict such pain and agony on each other. With what we've learned in the texts of Abdul Jabbar and the texts of other luminaries, how could so many people become so oblivious to the suffering of others? How could people go on with their lives untroubled when they know that children of their neighbors are rotting in political prisons, tortured, raped, killed? How could we drive by street children every day? This was in Egypt. I was also born in Kuwait, our Egyptian. How could we drive by street children every day as we know that they are tormented, abused, and often murdered without conscience? How could so many people live with themselves when they know the abysmal conditions and the suffering that children who serve in private homes as maids, in private homes as maids of the wealthy, are forced to endure. Khaddamin, Shagharin, for those of you who are Egyptian, you would know how they're treated. Sheikh Zawuri noticed, as he always did, that I was working myself into a rambling tirade. I was going off. He quieted me down by asking, Ibn, son, what are you looking for? A reason for the cruelty or a cure? I wondered loudly, well, is there a cure? I wasn't very polite, I would say. In response, Sheikh Jarudi simply recited the Quranic verse. If only people would have learned humility when suffering came to them from us, God. No, their hearts only become harder, and when their hearts had hardened, the devil made their foul misdeeds appear even more alluring to them. End quote of Quranic verse. In our idolatry, we become so oblivious, so absorbed in arrogance, we forget others, forget God, and forget ourselves. Sheikh Jarudi continued. I muttered as if to myself, we forget God until God allows us to drift in forgetfulness. Then I said in a louder voice, we'll continue reciting, we're continuing the Quranic verse, God reveals the signs so you might understand, but your hearts become as hard as rock, or even harder. And despondently, I started to walk toward the door, but I must have looked defeated because I heard the Sheikh say, why don't you complete it? I looked at her and said, complete the verse. Let me just put a context that when you recite this verse, that their hearts have become as hard as rock, what you're saying is there's no use, they're impenetrable. Then the end conclusion is, there's no point. I looked at him, but before I could respond, he proceeded to complete the Quranic verse, probably not trusting that I knew it. For there are rocks, he quoted, for there are rocks that are porous, through which streams flow. And there are rocks that split open, from which water pours out. And there are some rocks that crumble down in awe of God. And God does not fail to observe what you do. I stared at the Sheikh, looking stupefied and probably stupid. I'm not sure which. He commented rather matter-of-factly, son, even at our hardest, even when our hearts become so hard as rock, good like the water still comes, and even among the most obstinate, arrogant, at a single, unexpected moment, we fall to our knees in love. If water can come through the hardest of rocks, you think that God cannot come through the most forgetful of souls and the hardest of hearts? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Khaled Abou El Fadl. I'm flabbergasted, but I didn't expect less, and I think that we have had a wonderful lecture. We could have long conversations, but I'll open the floor. Please, brief questions to give the professor the possibility to answer. There is a walking microphone.
I will give you the microphone so that everybody can hear your question.
And can you identify yourself when you ask a question as a student or as a faculty? Timur.
Yes, hello. My name is Timur Iskay from my university. I have a basic question, which is, I may have misheard you, but what I heard were numerous instances where you could have used the word he while speaking about God, but you avoided that word. If I am correct, can you explain why?
No, you haven't misheard me. Let's say that if I would explain why, I would have to do a long prayer with you where we get to meet God together, and then let's talk.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Bill Brown here. I didn't quite catch the answer to your question as to whether God still does miracles and induces prophecy after the Prophet Muhammad. Because as Christians, we believe that Jesus Christ, as the Son of God, is still doing miracles today from heaven.
Well, not my answer, but regardless of my own personal beliefs, the kharq al-'ada, or the performance of miracles, is something that most theologians accepted and jurists accepted. But they accept it largely, if you'd say, in two main categories. One is as a pure act of mercy from God through direct divine intervention, unmitigated by anything except perhaps the angels, and that these types of miracles are an act of intervention that we often do not understand and cannot maneuver. The second are miracles that are performed contrary to contemporary modern dominant Islamic theology. Miracles are performed in the hands of those who have attained a position of intimate closeness to God. That that all miracles that they perform as basically saints in the name of God and as a manifestation of God's mercy. Now, of course, this is completely heretical for Wahhabi theology. But Wahhabi theology is a very recent modern phenomenon, largely that accompanied the age of colonialism itself.
Yeah, Sidi Mahmoud.
Let me see if my voice please. Oh, okay, thanks. You know, I am very involved in interfaith conversations and trying to find ways to describe our relationship to God. And I want to thank you because you have kind of you have strengthened my feeling that we can speak of the divinity in human being and the humanity in the divine. Now, Quranic idea of God breathing of His Spirit into Adam. But how can I speak of the humanity of God from an Islamic point of view?
I don't, this is, as you know, in the tradition of Kalam is something that there are numerous debates about, but, and especially debates between Christian theologians and Muslim theologians. I mean, unfortunately, one of the things that modern day puritanical movements have done is alienated Muslims from their own Kalam tradition. But my belief is that I do not need to worship a human God. What I need to worship is a God that is fully aware of what it is to be human. It's a part of what makes the divine divine in my eyes is the ability, a rare or an ability that you see only in human beings that have attained the highest level of divinity, and that is the ability to empathize fully and internalize fully without having gone through the experience themselves. When you truly meet a holy person, a saintly person, you find that they are able to feel what a woman is without being a woman, feel what a man is without being a man, feel what torture is without being tortured, feel what need is without necessarily having needed anything, feel what the anxiety that comes from wealth without himself having ever been wealthy. And my own study of the life of the Prophet often it symbolizes this to me, is this constant ability to get to more to point to your question, is that in a divine being that I worship is the epitome of that. And I do not need to humanize that divine being either in terms of tassim or corporality, or intellectually or emotionally, as long as I understand that mercy means the complete awareness of what it means to be a human being aspiring for divinity, or a human being drifting away from divinity, both.
I'm sorry, can I just make a small point? What about the Hadith Qudsi literature, and where God almost suffers with our suffering? We are told in a Hadith Qudsi that God every night comes down to the heaven of the world, and it doesn't say begs, but practically begs people to ask for forgiveness, to allow God to be God. And maybe this is, I wasn't really meaning worship. I want a way that I and the Christian who believes in the Trinity can talk about the divine without immediately getting to the dead-end street talking about three gods or one God in three manifestations or whatever.
That's why I started out by mentioning the tradition of Kalam.
Yes.
Because the puritanical, modern Puritanism was scandalized if they understood the Kalam books, which my experience is most modern Muslims cannot penetrate the Quran books anymore. But if they penetrated the Quran books, they were completely scandalized by the Quran's books that, although intended to be a tradition of apologetics, in other words, defending Islamic theology, distinguishing from Christianity, the irony is, for our modern age, it often it emphasized the similarities between the tradition. Because by our standards, so we have in numerous hadiths about God suffering, the suffering of every person who goes to bed without hungry. We have the hadiths that about God suffering every person who is tortured by an unjust ruler, that God goes through the suffering, etc., etc. So they exist, and in the Kalam tradition, they are schools of thought that said that this is that God goes through the suffering with the ability not to do so if God chooses. Now, I'm not sure that would necessarily be different from what Christians believe about God. But my response is what I choose to believe. I definitely think for someone who wants to take interfaith dialogue seriously and not simply as political pleasantries, there is going beyond puritanical Islam that dominates today. They'll find a great deal to work with, as I'm sure you will know.
Thank you. I'll take a lady.
I think I probably can speak loudly. I'm wondering if you could just give us a little hope in terms of what you see for the future. I am increasingly learning things that let me know that what I hear in the media is not truly what Islam is about. And I think you're referring to the puritanical Islamists of today. Do you see there being a branching off of, like in two kinds of Islam, just like Christianity branched off or whatever?
Well, I'll tell you this. Actually, thank you for asking this question, because first I wanted this could have been a separate lecture altogether, but I believe that goodness cannot be achieved on earth without a collective effort by human beings. The truth is that godliness cannot be achieved by spreading corruption on earth. And Islamic theology, I'm among those who believe that by definition, killing and destruction of living and non-living things is a corruption. Now, even sometimes, even if war is necessary in acts of self-defense, but it is still corrupting what God has built. And that is a very heavy moral responsibility. But this is the thing, that in the same way that doing good and goodness is a collective enterprise, evil and the promotion of evil is also a collective enterprise. There is no, I do not completely agree with Hannah Arendt that just evil is a product of banality. I actually think evil comes about when there is a collective desire to allow it to take over at every. And I want to say about this puritanical issue especially. We are at a critical moment right now, right? And I read, all of us know what people like ISIS are doing, etc., etc. Now, there are non-Muslims who write in response to this, this is, people don't generalize, and this is not Islam, and what these people do not represent all Muslims. That's true, but unfortunately, these are right now a minority of voices. You hear tremendous amount of voices that generalize what ISIS do as the real and true Islam. And in doing so, they are creating the swamp that we all will drown in eventually. And I have a material proof for you to consider about this. When the Wahhabi movement, and this is a long discussion in the book, and I really, if I could convince the publisher to publish this chapter separately as a separate book, I would have, because I think this particular, when Wahhabism arose in Najd, which is a very desert and arid area, what strikes me is that in the 1800s, there is an enormous amount of Muslims from Hijaz onwards. Hijaz is where Mecca and Medina are looking at it as an oddity, as a weird thing that will go away. Eventually, that movement, that desert movement that comes from Najd, overtakes Hijaz and proclaims sovereignty over Hijaz, which is the heartland of Islam, where Mecca and Medina is. Now, remarkably, the countries that recognize Najd's sovereign claim over Hijaz, the first countries are not Muslim countries. There were two Western colonial countries. And Muslim countries resisted recognizing that, because they looked at the Najd as the Najdi Islam, the Wahhabi Islam, as an aberration. So Egypt wouldn't give recognition for 3 years and was pressured by Britain to recognize the Wahhabi claim over Hijaz. And India wouldn't do it for 10 years and eventually was also pressured by Britain to recognize Najd's claim over Hijaz. But what is even more important and more remarkable is that before this takes place, we have a steady stream of travelers from the West. This is now the emergence of the colonial age. The West is discovering that they can travel in the world, and that wherever they travel, they have discovered it. And the reality doesn't exist until it passes through their consciousness. And you know, that complex that the white prototype had, that unless it is documented in their own narrative, then it is irrelevant. One of the most remarkable things that I document is that the first people to look at Wahhabi Islam and to say, oh, this is really horrible, but this is true Islam, were Western travelers. So here's an example, a quick example for you. This is an example from the 1834. Some writers lament the suppression of the Wahhabis from the belief the downfall of Islam was to follow the propagation of their doctrines, and that a pure religion would be established instead. These regrets appear to be inspired by erroneous conceptions of the principles of the sect, which are nothing else than the gross and primitive superstitions of the Quran enforced with greater rigor. Their creed was even more sanguinary and intolerant than that which the first followers of Muhammad offered to the nations on the points of their swords. Their reform extended only to a few absurd or scandalous practices and the more strict injunction of certain moral precepts, but they left untouched all the impious and heretical dogmas of the Muslim faith. Their chief merit consisted not in their teaching their countrymen a more refined and rational theology, but in suppressing their infidel indifference to all religion, in improving their political condition, and in subjecting their wild passions to the restraint of law and justice. Now, we see this in numerous scholars, Western scholars, saying they are like the Protestant Reformation, even some modern Western scholars, current living scholars. Others that say to describe the Wahhabi religion a recapitulation of the Muslim faith to show that they are in fact differ from the Turks who are the true heretics of Islam. So in other words, there was a consistent Western discourse that I document quite carefully, that the Wahhabis are the true Muslims and the Turks were the heretics of Islam. Now, the remarkable thing is that then I trace the Egyptian and Syrian and Algerian and Moroccan scholars who go to the West, read the texts of Orientalist scholars, and come back and say exactly, precisely the same thing. They use the same language, the same terminology, until I, as someone who grew up in Egypt and was educated in both secular and non-secular schools, in the secular schools, I learned that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was a reformer who returned Islam to its pristine, true self and destroyed the heresies of the Turks and the corruption that surrounded Mecca, only to discover later on that the heresies of the Turks was nothing but the various cultural manifestations of Islam that grew indigenously from a native engagement with this faith, and that sometimes it produced people who danced, sometimes it produced people who sang, sometimes it produced people who did weird things with their bodies, did miracles, I don't know, but it was extremely diverse, and that how odd it is for the colonizer to come in and say, well, you know, that's the true, these are the true faiths. Yes, they're barbaric, they're ignorant, they're intolerant, as many of the quotes that I have in the book say, they're savage, but you know what? That's really what Islam is. And that's really what Muhammad was all about. So it's okay, you know, that's just them. What I'm saying is that it took a collaboration of the colonizer and the native informant, and till today,